Put the talking sticks in.
Testing.
I'm going to put it where Deb's sitting. In the hope that she'll have to sleep. Yeah. Sleep.
So welcome back from afternoon tea, and it's good to see the quality attendees staying and persisting on a Friday afternoon at Southbank and not being tempted by outside just yet. So on our panel today, we have Inspector Peter Heck from the Queensland Police Service. We have Dr. Alyssa Waterson from the Queensland Forensic Mental Health Service. We have Heidi Stirk from the eMental Health in Practice. And we have Deb Blidner also from the Queensland Forensic Mental Health Service. And the aim of our panel discussion this afternoon is just to facilitate some discussion between the audience, the panel members and our attendees online around what are some of the challenges and solutions around implementation of digital solutions in a risk-aversive environment. So I'm going to start with a question from myself, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. I'll have some more questions. We'll open it up to online as well. So to the panel members, we've heard about how the use of technology in communication, management and treatment of offenders and forensic clients. So how can we convince forensic services and agencies to financially support the introduction of digital resources into work? So those that have understanding of policy, process, finances, bureaucracy. Thanks, Alyssa.
I felt like you were directing that to me, Elkie. I guess one of the things was what you spoke to earlier in your presentation is that it's really difficult to argue for funds in an ongoing way when there isn't any evidence about efficacy and appropriate use within a certain setting. And so I think that it is really important for us to look at time-limited projects and seed funding opportunities where we can build that evidence base and then hopefully use that to turn it into a program with more longevity and greater acceptance. And hopefully, as that happens across our service partners, they'll also be able to look at how that's working across jurisdictions and accept that evidence, I would hope. I think the other piece of work that is really important is catching up, thinking through the ethical issues, and then being able to operationalise that in meaningful policy. I think that at the moment, a lot of people are uncertain about, I guess, what sort of standards need to be met about that security of data, all of those kind of things. And I think that some leadership across departments is going to be necessary to make that happen.
Absolutely. And when we think about the small project that we did, and it was 18 months of approvals and processes and protocols and documentation and across agencies and academia to kind of, and now you're hearing about things like the standards that are being produced. So there's all these frameworks and standards that are out there now that are helping us. There's smaller projects across jurisdictions, internationally and nationally. So building on that, but then, yeah, also having that leadership within agencies and services.
Yeah, and I guess just on that note, I would just mention for those of us that are working in mental health services that the Mental Health, Alcohol and Other Drugs branch currently does have a digital transformation project happening. And so some of the team have actually reached out during the presentations and sort of said, look, this is an area where we can support you. And we would be very happy to come and meet with staff groups and have some input into that project into the future. So I think that is an opportunity for us.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. And
I think too some of the national programs like MindSpot and This Way Up could also be approached as well, because I know they're doing some partnerships with particular services. I don't know of any doing anything in the prison system yet, so that might be something to consider too. And I did have one question, even though I'm on the panel. I was just wondering whether, especially you, Elke, you've looked into what's happening in digital mental health overseas in prisons.
Yeah, so it's still quite limited.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when I think you went to the international conference where Singapore in the community was doing a lot of work, or someone, yeah. And it's interesting that in prisons, Singapore is doing a lot of work. So there's that government support and research, like a systems support for use of digital mental health technology in prisons. But everything else, it's small. And it's not necessarily centre-wide or service-wide. So we all seem to be starting in those small projects or time-limited projects sort of down low. So that's why I got kind of excited when I saw Corrective Service New South Wales doing this top-down project supported by infrastructure, service, and getting the technology into centres, and then we can build on that technology.
Yeah, I think the research or the work that they're doing is really going to be very valuable. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Beautiful. And from the rest of the panel, anything about what's worked for you in your projects, or what you think might work when you've tried to convince or had to convince the powers that be with implementation of digital mental health?
I guess I'll continue while I've still got this, then I'm happy to hand it over. I think the fact that there are some free national programs is a big incentive as well, because it's not like, you know, obviously implementation still takes time and staffing and costing around that, but in terms of actually running the programs, they're already existing and they've already got that evidence base and that they are free. So hopefully that's an incentive as well to maybe build some of that in as well, because I know cost is obviously a huge factor.
Yeah, so with the apps that we used, so the tool developers for the Measures and the Stay Strong app all provided use for us and training for us for free. So that was, so our money came from staff time and then more around programming and things like that. Yeah.
I think just building upon what Alyssa was talking about, in terms of running the pilots within secure settings, it also helps to change that culture and break down some of the fear that these tablets will be misused, that things would happen, as we heard in New South Wales, that no, it didn't actually increase the drug offences within the prison system despite them having access to this technology. And so those small projects all build to a bigger picture of people being more comfortable with it. And when Elke was doing the Stay Strong app in the first instance, the strengths in that project was the consideration of the risks associated with the technology and all of the different aspects she put in place so that that wasn't of concern to the leadership team when they went to approve it. So really thinking about that kind of risk side of things and mitigating against it early on helps to break some of that culture.
Oh, there's lots of questions.
Oh, hang on, I've got a microphone for you, Therese. Sam's going to come with a.
I was just wondering, is there any research being done at the moment on the recidivism of, like, if it lowers the recidivism of inmates, the use of the tablets? Because I kind of thought that's an interesting, like, thing. You know, it can sort of have an impact on their institutionalization, like, feelings and stuff. Just a thought.
So I had a chat to Julie quite extensively afterwards, and there hasn't been any studies specifically on that, but we spoke about the connection to community. So by increasing that connection to community through continued connection with family, trying to align people with positive community culture as opposed to prison culture. So one little step towards that. But no, there hasn't been anything around the tablets. And I think another question that just sort of, or another point that you sort of jogged in my head when we're thinking about DV. So we have a lot of people in prison, and some of the clients that I've worked with before, suddenly their partners disappear as soon as they come in, and it's a protective process for their partner outside. And with the tablets that they have in New South Wales, if there's any concern with the content of what they're saying on the tablets, it can be removed as a privilege, and they go back to the usual phone out in the yard system.
I wanted to kind of, I guess, expand on the challenges around risk management and how to get around those, like both in terms of the use, you know, of digital technologies, but also like at that higher level and the kind of governance level.
That is a very broad question. So look, I've got a couple of thoughts that might be relevant, and I guess it depends on at what level you're looking at risk management. I think certainly when it comes to I guess more extensive access to internet and things like that, there are obviously different concerns in working with groups of people who may be antisocial, may generally offend across a range of mediums. And that is something in forensic settings and in forensic mental health services that we do need to consider in terms of community safety and how that balances against our human rights and desire for least restrictive approaches and trying to normalise corrective environments to the community. So they are things that we need to think about. And so I think there does need to be some thought put into decision-making factors and, for example, offence type would be one of the decision-making factors that you take a look at. You take a look at whether somebody's sexual offending has involved digital technologies. You'd think about people who have potentially radicalised and been looking at ideologies on the internet. You think about people who've committed fraud and obviously technology-based offences. And so it's difficult to step through in a really, really thorough way. But obviously there are a range of factors that you'd have to go through almost a decision-making matrix that would guide people on the ground in those everyday decisions, because it's not always going to be, you know, a high-level manager and policymaker who's making those decisions. People on the ground need to feel confident to do that. And I think that's one of the other really important things in successfully using technology is making sure that we build staff confidence and capability, and that occurs in the right stage of the process. I'm just thinking about an example we have in Queensland currently, where there are a number of our forensic order patients have MHRT conditions, that their phones and other electronic devices be monitored by their mental health service. What that means is a little ill-defined, and staff feeling confident that they know how to do that. They know what they're looking for. I wouldn't know how to do it. And so there's been a lot of concerns raised. And so we've kind of gone to this step where we're using technology as kind of like a monitoring mechanism, but without enabling, creating that enabling environment for staff where they've been given enough training and direction, policy, etc., to guide their decision making. And so I do think that that's a really integral part of the process as well.
That's very similar to our experience when we brought in our body worns for that very reason, and we moved into that technology space. There wasn't enough training. They didn't sort of win the hearts and minds, and they used them as a monitoring process initially. And so officers were reluctant. They were very cautious about what they did. Over time, that we've started to develop them into something as a tool to assist. And so they're far more engaged in using them, understand the purpose of them. And there's other issues that the storage becomes a massive governance problem. It takes up an enormous amount of data storage once you start using this, because you've got to keep it. Where do you keep it? How do you manage it? And so we found that to be, as very much as said, initially we just didn't win the hearts and minds when we first did it, and we paid an early price, and now we're paying a heavy technology price to store it all. So, yep.
And it's interesting when you were talking today, Peter, I was thinking about, so you're providing the person on the scene with the autonomy and you're doing the coaching process, and there's not only written, but there's visual evidence that's happening and what's admissible in court and how that gets held and people's view. So if I was on the receiving end of the coaching, whether I feel more conscious about so much evidence going, is that a supportive or a hindrance?
Early on, very much a hindrance. It was, they were holding back in what they would normally do, because they were very conscious about the fact that every word not only being recorded, but held forever. Like someone can go back in 5 years' time when they're doing a review and look at that piece. And so, and then they move sort of beyond that with now the confidence that it's not being used as it's not being weaponized as some sort of disciplinary tool. It is used for that when it's appropriate, but that's not the purpose of it.
And so the team learning that that's not what it's used for and feeling the confidence and comfortable with that. Yeah.
Playing a bit of a devil's advocate here, if we're struggling to get, basic primary health care into prisons, get the necessary specialist mental health services into prison, who becomes responsible for this kind of innovation, etc.? Is it the health system that fights for this? Is it the QCS that fights for it? Because we've got so many competing demands. The digital transformation stuff has a lot to do with trying to make our services good enough in the first place, let alone going out and extending and all of that. And, it's not that I'm against prevention. You know me well enough, but where does that sit and how do you make those decisions?
I don't think it's one or the other that has responsibility. I think that we all do across mental health, primary health, and corrective services. We all hold a piece of the responsibility. And I think that's why days like today are great, because they do provide an opportunity to bring stakeholders together and to create a sense of opportunity, and to think outside of the box and to look at how we could do things differently, more effectively, because you're right, there's a huge gap there. And currently it's just not met, and we do need to work together to close that gap. Queensland Health can come up with all of the amazing solutions it wants to, but if we're not able to make them something that corrections can endorse, they're useless. So absolutely, it's a joint thing.
I completely agree. It is a joint thing, and there are a lot of competing uses of electronic devices in those secure settings, because of course we also have the legal community pushing for the courts to also utilise electronics to ease the transportation of people to court and facilitate those hearings that little bit easier as well. So I believe it is a joint and collaborative kind of approach, because we're also going to be using shared resources of the technology, because there just isn't the space for each of us to have our own.
And before the question, I think adding to that, so that academia being on behind the scenes just for those evaluations, so providing that secure, peer-reviewed evidence base, that so all the smaller projects add up to a bigger project, add up to what we're doing in this jurisdiction, shared information nationally, internationally, so we're not all working in these small silos, repeating the same processes and projects. Yeah, sorry.
Mine is necessarily a question. I just wanted to touch on the recidivism question. So it wasn't with iPads, but I don't know if you know the USQ Making the Connection project with Helen Farley. So they took secure learning platforms and took them into the prisons. So they're actually doing the tertiary prep program in prisons and doing an educational program there. And they did find that there was less recidivism for the people that went through that program, because you think of the protective factors post. So I actually work in the SHMU at the park, and we actually took that program. I just contacted them and said, can we do that in a mental health setting? And we just implemented it in High Secure and FTRU at the park, and people have been doing that for a number of years now. So I think I was just going to say, sometimes it's not reinventing everything, it's reaching out and seeing what's already there. And that really helped get the project over the line, because everyone was happy to say, oh, well, they use it in prison. That means that it must be safe enough to use within our hospitals. And so that adoption was a lot easier. And I think around just having small projects as well around just increasing comfortability. There's been other little small projects that we've done within our setting of doing a lot of training and getting people, having like champions and then getting people like, would you like me to come down and show you how to do it, and trying to integrate our systems a little bit more. So just like slowly chipping away. But I did guess have some question around how to change that attitude or fear. I know evidence is helpful, but sometimes even that doesn't work fully. So like how to change those attitudes for the people that are in those decision making.
And with changing attitudes, so what we found and what the research says around changing attitudes, starting with practitioner attitudes, and practitioners are most likely to going to change their attitudes if other practitioners around them in the team start to change. So part of the process of training so many practitioners, we trained hundreds of practitioners in the Stay Strong app, but we only needed 10 people trained in it, because we wanted to have this group thought and around the positivity of the Stay Strong app and how it could be used in custody, in the community, through transition. So having that knowledge and the attitude change, and then also getting feedback from clients. So it's the most powerful thing. So I went into the project thinking about quantitative data and, about the RCT, and that's the most important thing. But I'd say the most important thing that came out would be the feedback directly from prisoners. So listening to the men and women inside who I thought there's no way on God's green earth they're going to let me record their feedback, audio feedback. And they all did, that were asked to provide their feedback. And hearing about them talk not only about the I'm Hip program and project and the team members, but also the tablets and the app being a little moment of outside prison while inside prison. So having a different mode, something else to look at, and the process, sort of an empowered process of taking people through. So it's, so starting with attitudes of practitioners, and then reducing thoughts around risk for people that have the system that has to manage it, and then participants. I think so. It's a slow process, but if you can be like New South Wales and start from the top down, I think that's probably an easier way to go.
Thank you for the reminder of the education in those secure settings, because education is driving a lot of the changes in technology through basic necessity. Is that the university courses that people in custody have been doing for many years have of course become very online platforms for teaching, there's no such thing as, boxes of textbooks being delivered to the prison for people to use. It's all online. And the necessity as technology has advanced, has necessitated that the education within prisons has changed as well. And so, it's a nice, it's forging a pathway for us out of necessity to keep education available.
And the use of white pages. So it's not direct access to the internet from the prison. It's direct access to a server that contains data. So there's that limit of communication to the outside world. Beautiful. And I've got any questions from online? No, I've got a question about funding around, so the client group that we deal with, so the forensic mental health population, do you think that the value that the general community place upon the client group that we work with affects our access to funding and services for our client group in digital mental health? Loaded question. So it's probably what I call the career mail test.
Sorry.
So it's a little bit like the career mail test. So Elke wanted prisoners when they got released from prison ultimately to have a mobile phone with the Stay Strong app on it and professional contacts. But whether or not that would meet, I'm spending X amount of dollars on people being released from prison when there's a finite pool of resources available across health for all the people that we work with in health.
Well, most people, sorry, I know I'm not on the panel. Most people I talk to when I say I've got hold the portfolio of forensic mental health is like, what does that mean? So I don't even think, I think people kind of understand or kind of think they understand the idea of a schizophrenic killer or something like that, or that somebody gets off a heinous charge because of a mental, unfit, I just don't think that it's a group that's known about. I didn't even think that we really talk about much more than anxiety and depression, because that's why all the apps are associated with anxiety and depression rather than a lot of these other things. I just don't think there's much of a conversation out there in a community about these particular severe and enduring mental illnesses, but that's...
Yeah, I don't know that there's enough informed conversation. I think that we certainly experience stigma against people with mental illness. And then on top of that, stigma with people who offend. And I don't think that we could sit here honestly and say that politically they're an attractive group. And, that varies somewhat depending on whether the political environment of the day is leaning more towards a punishment perspective or more towards a rehabilitation perspective. But I think it would be naive to think that there is a lot of information out there that allows that well-informed discussion. And so I think that is something that we do need to promote, particularly with funding bodies, ensure that there is that understanding that that we're working with people. We're not working with an offender. We're not working with an illness. It's more than that. And so, I do think that there's work in advocacy that needs to come along with any innovation, whether it is digital or otherwise. Plenty of work to be done there. And I would like to also, I guess I was watching some of the presentations earlier and some of the ethical challenges around when interventions are delivered remotely or via apps, etc. Some of the potential detrimental effects. And I guess I wouldn't want it to swing it the other way, that we are so underfunded that we just rely on those and people don't get face-to-face contact and don't get that more intensive service provision that they need because they are a stigmatised group and we don't give them any money. And so I would hate to see it swing that way. And particularly when you think about factors for therapeutic success, if you have a look at what they've identified with what works in therapy, it doesn't matter necessarily if your modality is CBT, if it's ACT, if it's whatever. Most of the therapeutic factors for success are based on relationship. And so I think that whatever we do in the digital space, it still needs to be underpinned by relationship and those human factors.
Yeah, I agree. And I've really noticed in the last couple of years, that's the way the conversation's going around using digital tools with clinicians as well, seeing it as more of that blended care and that these are additional things that can help. Sometimes they might be something that someone relies on solely, but that's not generally how we're doing it because, yeah, just because people do need more than that. And so I think that's a really good point. And I'd also just like to make the point, I think having the champions for this group really helps because I go to lots of conferences and it's hardly talked about. So yeah, having days like this where you're sharing and learning from other people, and I think having champions that could maybe present at national conferences and let people know this is a group that's often ignored and that there's things that could be considered for them as well, especially conferences where policymakers are going as well. So, and I mean, even for my work, I had a peer support person come up to me and she goes, "Oh, Heidi, these booklets are wonderful for prisons. I've been taking them and sharing them down in Victoria." And I thought, oh, and so because it's not been top of our priorities either. And so having someone who's a champion coming and telling us makes us more aware as well.
And I think that's where also like days like today, it's about building those relationships with the network. And I think I can certainly do a plug for MPRAC and Menzies in that offering their services for free and offering to support and supervision and training throughout the whole process. So finding those connections that are going to support you through, I think, are absolutely essential. And yet sharing that information out there. So before we finish up today, is there anything from the panel that you'd like to share about when you think about, for example, implementation of body-worn cameras or the projects that we're doing in forensic mental health or MPRAC that you can see as a key, I guess, a key tip from the field about implementation? So something key that's really important for people if they want to get these into their service.
Very much to feed on from what you've just said, that they're not a replacement in any way, shape or form. They're there to support your activities. They're there to bridge distances, but under no circumstances should they replace person-to-person contact. As I said, we use it to hold, and then we're still going to send people, but it's to make sure that I can assist those people in the short term, which we didn't have the capacity for before, and then you sit back. Like I said, it's quite challenging. I call it, you take the veranda view and that's what you use it for, to overview, to make sure everything's going okay, to support, to coach and to help, but never to replace.
No, perfect. And I think that's it. So when I think about my use of digital mental health, it's always been to make therapy a little bit more creative about trying to bridge that gap between myself and the client or the group that I'm working with, about engagement, about finding alternative ways of having that conversation with someone. And, you know, for making life a little bit easier. So most of my work that I've done has been in science. So trying to make it a little bit nicer for a moment to make therapy a little bit more effective. Okay, so thank you very much for the panel. And before we'll give a round of applause for coming up. And if I can, so for people online and people in here, if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute or two of your time using a QR code checker and providing us with a little bit of feedback. Any feedback you do provide helps us improve it for next year. So we do offer these forums each year in November, and we hope to continue and hope to keep on improving. All right, thank you very much. And I'll let everyone do a bit of feedback before I do. And a huge thank you to Sam Martin, Deb Lindner and Amanda Cockle for doing the hard yards and the microphone work and the producer. Oh, and Megan too, thank you. The ring-ins. Oh, yeah. Yeah. All right. All right. Yeah.
So
Elkie has asked me to close today, and I realise this is a really dubious honour because I'm entirely cognizant that I stand between you and your Friday afternoon. So I'm not going to labour this particularly. I think we've had a really interesting day, and to be honest, when the day started with the discussion about how technology is being used in offending and how that's developing very rapidly, I have to say I just felt old and not particularly on top of things at all. By the end of the day, I did feel slightly more comfortable with the idea about how we can use technology in service delivery to improve it and make it more efficient, etc. So it was lovely to think across the various aspects of the double-edged sword that is technological advancement. So on that note, I will just say thank you to those who have stayed for the entire day in person. It's a massive effort on a Friday. And thank you also to those online. We do have a much larger online presence this year than we had in person. And so thank you for all of your participation and questions during the day. Thanks also to our presenters very much for your time and your expertise. We wouldn't have a day like this without you. And also finally, thank you very much to Elkie and to the assistants from Griffith Uni, because a lot of time and effort goes into the planning and preparation of these days, trying to make them run smoothly. We can't always prevent catering issues, but thank you so much, Elkie, for today. And I'll leave it at that.